Welcome to Conjuncture. My name is Jordan Camp. I'm really delighted to be here with my colleague, Leniqueca. Welcome. Leniqueca is an assistant professor of international and urban studies here at Trinity College. She's currently working on her first manuscript, Come Out of This World, Beyond Terrains of Criminalization to Where Life is Precious. Her work appears in influential venues such as Small Acts, American Anthropologist, Multimodality and Society, City and Society, as well as edited volumes including Sovereignty Unhinged. Throughout her scholarship, Professor Welcome has taken up and extended the work of critical theorists such as Sylvia Wynter to understand the current moment in Trinidad and the Caribbean, suggesting that the global apocalyptic present, as she puts it, make the time of human extinction seem actually here rather than approaching. I'm excited to speak with her today in the Trinity Library about her work, what she calls the tyranny of the present, and the possibilities of abolitionist politics today. So thanks so much for taking the time to speak with me today, Leniqueca. I really appreciate it.
Thank you, Jordan, for inviting me to do this talk.
Oh, it's a pleasure. It's a pleasure. Well, I want to talk about your manuscript, Come Out of This World, which is based on your ethnographic research in Trinidad. And there you explore the production of the figure of the violent criminal and post-colonial state formation. And you argue persuasively that state and masculinist violence in Trinidad is the outcome of plantation political economies. So while your study is based in Trinidad, you suggest that this analysis is, and I'm quoting you, familiar relations across many geographies globally, close quote. So can you help us understand the production of the figure of the violent criminal in Trinidad and beyond?
Thank you for that question. So I think I'll start by saying that for me, it's important to frame it as the production of the figure of the violent criminal to really continue to direct attention to that it's a figure, right? So that violent criminality is something that gets produced, gets learned, right? And so people come to understand then what the violent criminal is, and that gets placed upon people. And I think it becomes important for me to discuss violent criminality in that way to continue to really destabilize the idea that people commit harm because of some kind of inherent deviance or some kind of inherent problem. So to continue to really situate harm amidst sociopolitical and historical relations, I really always try to use that kind of linguistic device of the production of the violent criminal to really kind of keep that at the kind of front of the audience's mind. And so what I really try to do in the research is to really kind of track how processes of racialization, how gendering happens, and how particularly how criminality gets configured, right, in relation to how race and gender get configured. So in my work, I'm really trying to unpack how blackness and criminality get entangled, right? And that's not just a project that happened in Trinidad. It's a project of the plantation. So that's why I say like they're familiar relations that happened across different geographies, right? That it comes to manifest in locally specific ways, but it's part of a broader project of racialization and criminalization. So I really try to work through in the work how, in order to maintain a plantation society, right, based on racial logics, that whiteness and particularly white bourgeois masculinity is the only kind of configuration of human that gets to be normatively human, and that's really building on the work of scholars like Sylvia Wynter, right? I really try to show that in making that project, how blackness gets criminalized, and then that continues to affect society even after formal emancipation and formal decolonization. And I say particularly formal emancipation and formal decolonization to really also kind of keep at the front of the minds that emancipation hasn't really and decolonization hasn't actually fully been realized, right, in the Caribbean, and many Caribbean scholars are argue this point, including some kind of recent work by Ronaldo Walcott on this, on the long emancipation. So by really being attentive to all the ways that criminality is produced and the criminal is produced as a figure that can be known and can be understood, and people can be slotted into that category, I really try to, like, tracking that, I really try to then understand how processes of harm, how violence is really part, that happened in a particular contemporary moment, is really part of a longer trajectory, right, rooted in the plantation. And so to kind of really put that in a very grounded way, really trying to understand how contemporary violence in Trinidad, which is categorized as gang violence, right, and gets addressed with highly punitive measures because it's seen as deviant young Black men involved in harm against each other, and not only that harm happens between Black men, but that's really how it gets configured in the media, right? So a lot of the kind of violence against women gets effaced. But what I try to do is really unpack harm that's happening, right? And so rather than continuing to read it as just interpersonal events that are happening between people, to understand what makes this possible, right? And to say that it's not just socioeconomic factors, right? Because I mean, there's a large body of scholarship that will tell you that, like, that this is coming out of socioeconomic conditions, that people are fighting for resources and things like that. And while, yes, of course, that's like central to my work, I really try to expand that as well, to think about the ways that what it means to be human has been configured, and how that also makes this violence possible, right? So if only white, wealthy masculinity can be normatively human, what does it mean then, to be living on the margins and to still be within the constrictors, gendered constrictors, in which you are expected to perform your masculinity in a certain way, but you don't have access to those normative means that others that are seen as more respectable can, and can then enact their masculinity through the kind of resources that they have access to, right? So I really try to think through then how then generally these young men who are being kind of demonized in the media, how they're enacting their masculinities through the means that they have access to, which becomes within communities through particular forms of violence, right? So really the move is to try to link that violence back to the kind of colonial foundations, and to really at once take stock of harm that is occurring. So it's not that I'm trying to face a harm that's occurring by violence that's happening within the community, but to really always take stock of that harm is connected not only to state violence, but also connected to a longer colonial violence.
Thanks for this. I wonder if you could say a little bit more about your argument regarding masculinist violence. You said that violence against women is often effaced, and I wonder how you see that obfuscation taking place.
In my research, what I really try to look at are the multiple forms in which what I term masculinist violence is being enacted, right? I find it productive to use the term masculinist violence to really, again, kind of signal to my audience, right, that multiple forms of violence are really kind of rooted in gendered logics of what it means to be human, right? And during my time doing this field work, what I realized is that there's so much state attention to what is seen as urban gang violence, right, quote unquote, and I put that always in quotations because I try to trouble in my work the term of gang violence, right, because I think that really kind of narrows the attention onto the kind of singular event of that violence and not the longer histories upon it. And I think it also doesn't capture the complexity of what's happening, right? Because I think it becomes really reductive to frame it as gang violence because it's not really capturing all the kinds of relations that are happening on the ground. But that aside, so much attention goes to that kind of violence, right? So if you look at the front pages of newspapers, if you watch television shows, it's always about like a young black man murdered another young black man, right? And it's similar to in the U.S. where like there's all this like hyper and moral panic about black on black crime, right? And the kind of problems of framing things like that, and so what I've realized in field work, like there's all this attention on that kind of violence and not as much, panic and fervor about violence that are happening to women in the same field site that I was working in, right? So at the time I was doing research, and even after doing research, many cases of women being murdered, either by a partner that they're intimate with, or in some cases by a stranger, or in other cases even by the state, right? And not as much outcry about it, and not a particular kind of outcry. So even though there is some recognition and outcry about it, not really as much framing it as a kind of national crisis in the kind of way that gang violence gets framed as a national crisis, right? That needs to be addressed. And so what I really try to do is to bring attention to this violence that's happening to women, but at the same time try to handle that with care so that it doesn't, quickly devolve into another means by which oftentimes their intimate partners are men. So another means by which young black men in low-income communities get demonized, right? So I think the constant move and maybe the constant work that I'm trying to do and I'm trying to be attentive to and trying to do carefully is how do you really take stock of harm that is happening to people without allowing that harm to be framed as some kind of pathologized being committing harm, right? So how to take stock of that harm without it being seen as someone's committing harm because there's something inherently wrong with them, right? Rather than all the kinds of social processes that make this harm possible. So I really try to look at even intimate partner violence as a form of masculinist violence that's always entangled with the violence of the state, which itself is always a derivative of the kind of colonialist violence of the project of conquest, right? And so that's really one of the kind of major moves in the work, to really think about how violence that is happening on different scales are entangled, and to really think about their foundations in the space of the plantation.
Thanks for this. And, it makes me think your analysis of the plantation political economy also involves climate disaster. You wrote a 2020 Small Acts essay, which was entitled The Infrastructures of Liberation at the End of the World. And there you discuss the 2018 Greenville floods in Trinidad and Tobago. And you trouble the idea that this was a natural disaster, and instead suggest that the events need to be understood as an outcome of at least a 500-year economic model. I mean, go back to 1492. I wonder, can you talk about this insight? How do you understand what you call the not-so-natural disasters in the region? And what is the significance of understanding what you call the tyranny of the present?
So in that piece, I'm very much in conversation with other Caribbeanist scholars who make this point. And I think most directly you can kind of hear the voice of Yarima Boni and Marisol Lebron and their work on aftershocks of disaster, particularly thinking about Puerto Rico and Hurricane Maria. And in one of Yarima Bonia's pieces, she references an ethnographic moment in where one of her interlocutors makes a statement that the real disaster wasn't the hurricane, it's coloniality, right? And very much in the piece, I'm trying to bring some of this out, right? And I would say that in the same vein of the way that I work with moments of violence, it's how I work with moments of ecological disaster, right? Always asking the question of what makes this possible. And that's where thinking about not so natural disasters become useful and which is not my term, but a term that I'm drawing on to think about the Greenfield flooding in order to really kind of critique the response of the state after these disasters, right? Because oftentimes what happens is that the state kind of pulls out its responsibility, saying that it was a natural disaster. Like, this is the one thing that we couldn't control, right? And then whatever response that's read as like benevolence, because we are responding to something that was out of our control. And what becomes interesting to explore is all the things that really exacerbate the kind of natural weather occurrences. So for the Greenville flooding, yes, the government can control the rain, but they could have controlled where a housing development that they were responsible for was built, right? And so they built this housing development in a floodplain where multiple rivers ran through the floodplain and alongside the floodplain. So environmentalists had already warned that even if it's not flooding now, you're on a floodplain eventually, right? There will be a flood. And even when they were constructing the development, there was a flood. And so they ended up putting in these retention ponds and these pumps to pump water. But it's also controversial if that could have even helped in this kind of flood. But even if it could have helped, the pumps weren't working at the time. So all of this is kind of maintenance that the state was supposed to be doing that wasn't there, right? And so at multiple moments, the state put its citizens at risk, and that is what made it possible then for people to kind of lose everything in these floods, right? And so that's why it always becomes useful to think about natural disasters as not natural, right? Because a lot of it is, and we see this in several cases, Hurricane Katrina, in the US context, it becomes really one of the big ones that people always gesture to, where you can see where state neglect really makes these natural disasters catastrophic for people. And not just catastrophic for everyone, but catastrophic for people who already were vulnerable prior to this moment, right? So it's always the people who are already at the margins of the nation-state project who are most affected when these not so natural disasters occur. And why I really try to then think about this moment of Greenville in the larger context, and really think about what does it mean about really the temporality of the Caribbean and what moment are we in, is because I think several things get revealed if you look closely at this case, right? And so at one, in the article, I really kind of follow the story of one of my interlocutors who actually moved from an area in Trinidad that was considered a crime hotspot to Greenville in order to make a better life for herself and her sons, right? And so she was particularly worried about her son's exposure to violence, and so moved them to Greenville, which was considered a safer area, in order to make life for them. And then she really kind of loses, most of her possessions in this flood. When I'm talking to her 1 year after the flood, the walls are still unpainted. They're still doing repairs. She's still trying to catch her way. And what is really kind of tragic about the story is that her son, the very son that she was trying to protect, one of the very sons she was trying to protect by moving out of the previous community that she lived in, got caught out that day in the flood, right? And was luckily rescued by a neighbor. But for a day, she had no contact with her son because she was outside of the community at the time that flooding happened, right? So for very much on that day of the flood, her son's life was put at risk and she almost lost her son. So this moment to her really reads as another kind of violence that her son was exposed to, right? While she was trying to flee another type of violence, right? And both you can track both of them back to how the state project. So if you look at that moment and kind of read it into the past, right, and read it into the future, it really kind of brings out the ways that we feel like we're stuck within conditions where, to black life, and I particularly talk about low income black life in Trinidad is continuously exposed to premature death, to draw on Ruth Wilson Gilmore. And even when this woman is trying to escape that with sons, again, being caught up in it and being told that it's not the state's fault, it's a natural disaster, but very much being exposed to these multiple violences that the state is responsible for, it can really make it feel like there's no way out, right? And I think that's where the term, the kind of tyranny of the present, feels like that there's this kind of constantly being exposed and not feeling like one can escape that. And also drawing on the work of Elisa Trotz, she has a line that says, and she's talking about party politics in the Caribbean, and says that there's exchange with no change, and to paraphrase what she says. And that kind of really describes, I think, a kind of general a general feeling of the kind of current temporality that we're in, that things exchange and there's little shifts and there's little reforms, but it doesn't really feel like we're getting out of it. And so that's why I discuss the tyranny of present, but I find it important to not end there, right? So rather than mourn revolutions that didn't come to be, or rather than mourn the fact that it feels that revolution in the ways that it's been configured is not possible, why not try another way, right? And try the way that people have been configuring as the way, abolition. And I think then trying to understand how people are making and participating in an abolitionist project, even when they don't acknowledge that, or even when they don't conceptualize themselves as abolitionists, has become really productive for me. So that's too why infrastructures of liberation becomes a productive frame to think through this, right? So you're not necessarily making the movement that's on the surface, but you're making all of the like pipework, all of the infrastructure that's necessary for that movement that you'll one day kind of build, right? And that's why infrastructures of liberation becomes a productive frame for me. So rather than only looking at the surface of the things that are explicitly being done in an abolitionist framing, to look at all the kinds of ways, all the kinds of networks of moves that people are doing in their everyday, that's also building a foundation for abolitionist work, right? And so in that piece, I really kind of try to bring out quieter moments when people just, even simple things like reject participation anymore in party politics, right? And in that reject these kinds of formal ways of voting and relying on governments as their only way to to bring about any kind of change, right? And so then start to really kind of rely more on community structures, right? And so the people I'm working with, they don't consider themselves abolitionists. That wasn't any of the language that they use, or in any way conceptualize themselves as part of an abolitionist project. But they're doing that work of like building community capacity, right, and refusing to play the game of the state. And so I find paying attention to that and thinking about how that kind of work is being done in multiple places already at the same time, and in some ways are building an infrastructure and network, even if they're not directly in conversation with each other, but building that capacity, right, for the kind of collective work that needs to be done. So, and I think it's important because, as abolitionists say, that, it's not a destination. It's not like something that we're getting to. It's constant work that's being done, right? And so for me, it's paying attention to that work, even when that work isn't described explicitly as being part of this project.
Yeah, and in this regard, your work is, of course, inspired by the abolitionist geographer Ruth Wilson Gilmore and her conceptualization of where life is precious, which is part of your subtitle. And, in your writing, you argue abolitionist praxis is absolutely critical for the construction of the kind of infrastructures required for building freedom in the region, we could add in the world. So can you discuss this concept of abolitionist praxis and the political stakes in this approach?
Why I find it useful is to really think about to really think about abolition as a praxis, right? So not just particular moves, but a way of moving through the world, right? And again, to see how they're kind of enacting that praxis, even if they're not explicitly saying that they're doing it, right? But how people are already doing that. And so why it becomes useful for me to kind of work in this way is to really, in some ways, expand the body of people that we see engaged in this project, right? And so, again, in trying to really cultivate hope, right? And I don't mean this in a superficial way. I don't mean I'm trying to gather numbers, but to really think about that the ways in their everyday people are really challenging this humanist project, right? I think that helps us to see a way, and it helps us to make a way. And so just everyday things like people continuing to live, right? And like continuing to live and continuing to demand that their life be treated as precious and treating their life as precious. I see that as an abolitionist practice, if particularly when you understand the state's project is your extinction, right? And that's something one of my interlocutors really directly says to me, right? That he sees the war and crime project of the state as really a genocidal project, and that's where my title comes from. Like he says that they're actually trying to make them come out of this world, and so to really, even under those conditions, demand that you will live, right? And you will continue to live. I think, for me, it actually does do the work of coming out of this world, but in a different sense, right? Coming out of this anti-Black genocidal extractivist world that we have into a world where Black life and life unconditionally can be seen as precious. So looking at these kinds of moves that people are making and the ways that they are enacting an abolitionist practice becomes really insightful for me in my work.
Yeah, and I want to ask you about the importance of your method in this regard. You penned an essay in 2020 entitled "After the Ash and Rubble Are Cleared" for the American Anthropologist, and there you draw on Black, Indigenous, feminist scholars to argue for the importance of ethnography aimed at material transformation, as you put it. And your ethnographic practice, as you described there, is geared towards, on one hand, attending to these dynamics of everyday life, and on the other, dismantling the structures, as you describe, of white supremacist, imperialist, heteropatriarchal, ableist, and capitalist formations. So can you say a little bit more about the importance of your method? And how do we understand the critical importance of ethnographic research geared towards material transformation today?
Yeah, so that article came out, so it was part of a collective response to another article written by anthropologist Ryan Cecil Jobson. And really, his article was making a critique of the kind of current state of anthropology, right? And really asking the question, do we let anthropology burn? Right? And this comes out of, a long history of critique about the discipline of anthropology and its colonial foundations, and how those colonial foundations are still expressed in some of the present work, right? And because anthropology as a discipline was kind of so central to this project that I'm trying to critique about of Western humanism, there's always a question of then what is our responsibility today as anthropologists, right? Knowing that even if you're doing radical work, you're all part of this field that's part of this of this violent project. I mean, with a caveat that no kind of modern discipline coming out of the Enlightenment is not also guilty of being part of this project, but anthropology gets a special amount of flack because of its kind of explicit participation, and deservedly so. So they question scholars who are interested in more radical politics and really thinking about alternative futures. The question that they've been asking is, what do we keep from anthropology, if we keep anything at all, right? And one of the things that, that I try to talk about in this piece in conversation with other anthropologists is the kind of work of ethnography, right? And my mentor, Deborah E. Thomas, always talks about this, right? Like for her, it's the ethnographic method that brought her to anthropology, and maybe the one of the kind of key things that keeps her there, right? And for me, I also see the potential in ethnography as really, as our colleague Christina Heatherton says, as a grounded way of knowing, right? And what I feel remains useful about the ethnographic methods is the way that you engage with people over a long period of time in their everyday, and you pay attention to the kind of really granular moves that people make. Because I think if you continue to look at the bird's eye view of what's happening, it's easy to go back to get stuck in that tyranny of the present, right? And so being with people and seeing, how they continue to make life even when pushed to death, right, is really the power of ethnography for me, and why I find it as such a useful method, and really what brought me in many ways to anthropology, and why I continue to engage in anthropology as a discipline, and even with all the necessary critiques of what anthropology has done and does.
Yeah. Well, in addition to being trained in anthropology and an international and urban studies scholar, also someone deeply enmeshed in the field of Black studies, you're also a designer and a photographer. And, you interpret the dynamics of the plantation political economy and also imagine abolitionist futures through this interdisciplinary approach. And so, for example, in your manuscript, you organize each chapter around a series of what you term collages, and textual and visual in particular. And so could you talk about the form that the chapters take as collage, and why was it important for your argument to take that form?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you for that question. So collage, and I use collage as a methodology in kind of multiple ways through the manuscript. So they're actual collages within it. So they're these images that are composites of images that I took during field work, and sometimes with some archival images within them. And then I also really describe the ways that the text is put together as a form of collage, both in the ways that the text interacts with the images, but also how I compose the text, right? So chapters will often juxtapose moments from like the 19th century, the 70s, and the contemporary moment, right? And this is not to make some kind of false equivalences between those moments, and to know and to say something like, like it's exactly the same as when people were enslaved or something like that. But what it is meant to do is to really think across time and space, right? And so that's why collage is an appealing method to me, because it's at its core, it's about, in a single frame, thinking about multiple temporalities and multiple spaces. And so because of, as I explained earlier, the kind of move that I'm trying to make in the project of always unpacking these contemporary moments of harm as part of a larger story that happens across space and time, collaging just felt like the method that really gets at that, right? So it's not just me telling you that this is a moment that is happening across space, but it's like actually showing through the ways that I craft the project. So that's kind of one of the main ways that collaging is important to me. But there's a second thing that collage brings, and that's critical to the project, and drawing on the work of Edouard Glissant, it's opacity, right? And so one of the things when I started doing fieldwork early, and I would take images within my field site, was that I started to get some anxieties about what does it mean to produce images within this space, right? And so what does it mean to produce images? And I use the term often in my work of overexposed spaces. So I work largely in what is described as East Port of Spain, Trinidad, and it's a highly documented space. And it's categorized similar to how people say the like inner city of the US, and represented in a very similar way, right? So I found myself, really trying to be careful about what I took, about images that I took, and really trying to capture people and not place them in, what anthropology calls the suffering slot, which comes out of the savage slot, or like really what people largely say. I didn't want to produce a ghetto porn, and that's always the dangers of doing this kind of work, right? And working in the site that I work. And so I tried to, craft images with care, make sure that, that I represented in people in ways that they felt comfortable with, and like that, like at family moments, or like at a community event, something about joy, not about pain. But even with that, I got some anxieties about what I call this like realist images, right? And kind of really understanding that audiences come to images with their own histories, right? And their own baggage and their own reading. So really kind of through looking at how images of the community are taking up in the local context, and seeing how people would make comments on social media and things like that, it really kind of made me aware of like, could any image, even with like the most amount of care and like that I thought was like a positive image, could it be read in that way because of the ways that people already criminalize this space? And so what collaging really allowed me to do is not only to, when I take those moments, put it in conversation with other moments, to really try to direct the audience to thinking about larger histories and not just a singular event or a singular person. But what I also wanted to do with the collage is really produce images where audiences didn't feel like they could already know anyone who's being represented or the kind of conditions that are being represented in the frame. So with collage, I really felt that it gave me the ability to abstract things and really, in some ways, destabilize that all-knowingness of the camera and the frame. So people often come to the images kind of confused about like what exactly is going on here. And I think that that's an intentional move to kind of leave people a little confused, to slow them down and to actually kind of force them to engage with the image and really try to read the image and really then see kind of multiple things that are happening there, but also not see things and give people a level of opacity within the image, give my interlocutors a level of opacity. And I try to do the same thing in the writing. So in my manuscript, it's not the kind of ethnography where you follow the story of a select group of people through time. Right? I describe it as they move in and they move out within the story, and because really I see my object as really thinking about this figure of the criminal, as really looking at this figure of the criminal and not looking at people's lives, right? So within the work, the collaging really helps me with that, and by pulling these scenes from different moments to really never allow the reader to feel like by the end of the ethnography, they knew this particular person. Even though, I mean, I use pseudonyms and things like that. It's kind of standard things in ethnography to obscure people's identity. But I don't want them to even feel like they can know that a person that I've constructed. So I want to kind of really always keep the attention on the phenomena that I'm discussing. And so that's the other thing that collaging really gives to me.
Right. I really appreciate the ways that collage offers a way of seeing into places that are often deemed dead or dying, And in this way, it reminds me of something that one of my mentors, Clyde Woods, would often suggest, that when talking about Black life in particular, that the autopsies were premature. And it seems to me that likewise you're attendant to the possibilities of social life. And I wonder if you could talk about how collage gives us a particular insight in that regard.
Yeah, I think I would answer that question kind of two ways that I kind of see collage is doing this. And so the first, as I already mentioned, in what felt productive about collage to me was that ability to really layer multiple times in multiple spaces within. And so what I really try to do in the collage is to not just capture these kind of the histories of violence, right? But really also captures the ways that futures are being made, right? And so that's what feels productive to me about collage, that in one frame that one can do that, to always gesture to the ways that life is being made, that people are surviving, but not just surviving, making a way. And so that the conversation doesn't just stay at that space of death, like you mentioned, right? And so there, because there's a lot of debate about this, like a lot of debate about what Blackness means, and a lot of debate about Black death and how all encompassing it is or should be. So what I really try to do in the work is always juxtapose the conditions that are making Black death, but the conditions that are making Black life as well, to always have the two intentions and always think about the ways captivity and flight are happening simultaneously. What I also see as the power in collage is the ways that it enables embodied ways of knowing. And why this becomes really important to me is because, as I described, people oftentimes engage with the spaces that I work with as already knowing, and already knowing what to see. To continue to work only with individual, I think, runs the dangers of producing material that people come to feeling again that they already know how to know. The people that I work with. So for me, then it becomes important to think about other modes, other channels through which to know, and following Black feminist scholars thinking about the work of the body, the work in the body of destabilizing that dominance of the visual, and encouraging audiences to feel something, to feel something towards someone that they aren't socialized to feel something towards. So for me, I really see the collage as really contributing towards building really an infrastructure to care, to care for others beyond oneself, and to care for others who are not seen as worthy of being cared for generally.
Yeah, thank you for this work and for this invitation to move beyond criminalization and towards, where as you put it, life is precious. Is there anything that I haven't asked that you would like to add?
So I think as a final note, I think throughout we've been talking, I've kind of continuously referenced, another world, a radically different world in freedom and these concepts. And I think maybe something that I try to talk about in the manuscript that doesn't come out in our conversation is what do I actually mean, or what do I envision when I say freedom, and I should say, what do I envision in collection with others, right? And because it's always important for me, and this is why constantly through the talk I'm referencing who I draw on, to kind of always put at the front that this is collective work and not of my possession, my singular possession. And for me in this project, I've used, drawing on Ruth Wilson Gilmore, Life is Precious. So thinking about a world that's radically different would mean that it would be a world where all life is precious, even life that is found to commit harm. But in conjunction to that, what I really try to discuss is that freedom then looks and feels like being able to live as one wants to in one's body, collectively with others, in the way that they choose, on the single condition that it's not harming someone else, to make it possible that other people can also live in their body in the way that they choose. So I really try to think through freedom as a kind of sovereignty of being that's always cognizant of its place in a collection, right? So that one can't live as one desires in one's body and harm another, because then it infringes upon another's freedom. So that the conditions of free will, that where everyone is free, is that one cannot then enact harm. So I've been trying to really kind of work through what that means, and then what that looks like, and building the capacity for living free without infringing on other people's ability to live free. And this is really in kind of direct response to how we conceptualize freedom kind of currently as more as individualism, right? And so I think about the current movement with like people saying that I should be free, not to wear a mask, but it's like, and the ways that Western liberal freedom really is about individuality and the ability to do what one wants. And so I've been thinking about, how do you take that, right, and respond to that, that there's a real need for people to be able to live as they want in terms of like having economic stability and sexual freedom and live as one wants in that ways, but the kind of then necessity that harm shouldn't be acted in that individuality, which is what we currently have, right? That freedom means the kind of right to own property and to build your own capacity, which is directly tied to the extraction from others, right? So how to at once make a call that people should have a right to be free in their body, but one cannot have the right to harm and extract others in order to make that possible. And so that's kind of what I conceptualize as what freedom being, and really the kind of futures that my work is engaged in participating in crafting as a kind of response to the present that we have.
Well, thank you so much, Leniqueca. Welcome for taking the time to speak with me today. I really appreciate it.
Thank you for having me, Jordan.
It's really a pleasure. And thank you to our viewers and listeners for joining us for this episode of Conjuncture. Please stay tuned.